Maryam Namazie is an Iranian exile, an outspoken opponent of militant Islam and a campaigner against Sharia law. Maryam Namazie, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here.
To what extent does the existence of Sharia law in places like Pakistan provide protection, moral or otherwise, to perpetrators of terrorist acts?
Well, I think because actually when you look at Sharia law, it is itself really, in my opinion, an act of terrorism, a terrorism against citizens, against women, against gays, against men and children. And so in a sense, I think it helps to feed off and encourage terrorism and excuse it in many instances.
Before we get on to broader subjects, in several countries, including Australia, customary law applies in a number of cases, in a range of cases involving Indigenous people. What's the difference between that and the application of Sharia law in societies where Muslims are not dominant?
Well, I'm opposed to the application of Sharia law anywhere, whether Muslims are dominant or not, because the reality is that just because someone's a Muslim doesn't necessarily make them a Muslim that wants Sharia law to begin with. Plus, there are so many different types of beliefs in any given society, like there is in Australia. The difference is that, from my understanding, is that the Aborigines are judged according to the same law as everybody else in Australia, whereas with Sharia law, it's a different set of laws and standards for people who are deemed to be different, which I find quite racist, actually, when you look at it, because it's saying that just because people are Muslims or born into Muslim families, they shouldn't have the same rights and freedoms as other people in Australia or elsewhere.
And just how insidious do you think is the introduction, the gradual introduction of elements of Sharia law into even the British legal system?
Well, I think it's very insidious, because the reality is that even though they say it's got nothing to do with the criminal aspects of Sharia law, like the amputations and stonings and so on and so forth, the family aspects of Sharia law are just as scandalous, really, when you look at them, because they are pillars of women's discrimination against women and violence against women, really, in countries under Islamic rule. So, for example, even in the area of civil matters, family matters, you find that in a Sharia court, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. That means that there are two women needed to give equal evidence to that of a man's. Women don't have the right to child custody after a preset age. Children must be given to their father irrespective of the welfare of the child. And again, that violates human rights laws and public policy, where welfare of the child should come first. Women have very limited rights to divorce. Men have unilateral right to divorce, women don't. And you find that oftentimes in these courts, violence against women has been excused. A Sharia judge recently said in Britain that there is no such thing as marital rape. To call it rape is actually the act of violence and aggression, not the actual act that takes place against the woman.
Given what you've just been saying about women and Islam, where do you stand then on the banning of the burqa, as has happened in a number of countries, but most notably in France, a country which has quite solid links to Arab countries?
The reality is that the veil is, very much a symbol of women's oppression, really, because why do women need to be veiled to begin with? It's because if they're not veiled, they create fitna and chaos in a given society. And, obviously adult women, even though there's very little choice involved, have the right to wear the veil, and I put that in quotes because take away all the pressures and intimidations of the Islamic movement, and then it becomes very clear how many would actually like to veil, because it does come with a lot of threats and intimidations. But with the burqa in particular, I think it's really nothing more than a body bag or a mobile prison, and it should be banned, not because of security reasons, not because it makes people uncomfortable and they can't see the face of the woman, but from a woman's rights perspective, it needs to be banned.
Let's turn to another European country. Denmark has had a particularly testy relationship with its Muslim community, which has grown quite rapidly. Can that be traced back to those newspaper cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, or is it the difficulty that Denmark has actually had in assimilating its Muslim citizens?
From my perspective, really, I think the rise of Sharia law isn't related to the rise of so-called Muslim immigration. As I mentioned before, no community is homogeneous, and neither is the Muslim community. It's not one community. There are free thinkers and activists and campaigners and secularists and dissidents within that so-called community, and actually calling it a community limits the space that people have to be able to dissent and breathe easily and freely. I think actually if you look at the history of Sharia law in contemporary society, we see that it's linked to the rise of the Islamic movement. So even in Britain, for example, there were no Sharia courts until the early 80s, right after the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the rise of the Islamic movement internationally. And so I think actually, in a sense, it's wrong to blame the numbers of Muslim immigrants. I think what's happening is politics is at play. This is a political movement, and in a sense you have Western governments, the Danish government, the British government, appeasing sections of this movement because it's in a sense trying to push back the terrorist wing of this movement. I think actually the political and terrorist wing are quite interlinked with each other. So the rise in Sharia law will bring a rise in terrorism and violence in a given society. So I think we need to focus on pushing back the Islamic movement. A lot of these, from the Danish government to many other European governments and Western governments, have close relations with Islamic states that are pillars of Islamic terrorism and political Islam globally. So I think we need to focus on that rather than, trying to limit Muslim immigration. A lot of immigrants have actually fled Islamism and Sharia law, and many of them, like myself, are at the forefront of battling it, including in Europe and the West, wherever we end up seeking refuge.
One final question. You've been quite critical of Islam for its failure to recognise what Christianity has come to, that is the separation between the powers of church and state. Can Islam make that leap of faith? Is it redeemable? What about countries like Indonesia and Turkey, where there appears to be coexistence of democracy and Islam?
I think increasingly we're going to see that coexistence not being able to happen, and more applications of Sharia law. Now Sharia law is actually the most implemented law worldwide. I think the only way we are going to succeed in seeing a situation in which Islam is a private matter and not in the state and political power is by pushing back the political movement. I think that's crucial, really. In a sense, I believe we're living under an Islamic Inquisition today, and so it's not just a question of people's religion, it's a question of battling a political movement that is actually hanging people in city squares for apostasy, stoning people to death still in the 21st century. So we need to fight this movement politically. We need to make sure that religion becomes a private matter, and the reality is the only time it will become a private matter is if it's pushed out of the public space, out of state, out of the educational system, and out of the judicial system.
Maryam Namazie, thank you very much.
Thank you.